How do you save seeds, and why is it so important? On today's show, we're going to be talking to Mike Bollinger of Seed Savers Exchange about the role that seeds play in preserving biodiversity in our food system and why it works so much better when it's done in community. You're listening to Down to Earth, the Planet to Plate podcast, a co-production of the Radio Cafe and the Quivira Coalition. I'm your host, Mary Charlotte Domandi. We'll be back right after these quick announcements. Find your next job or employee on Quivira's new Regenerative Ag Job Board. For years, Quivira has connected employers and job seekers through a listing of job postings in the monthly New Agrarian newsletter. Now you can check out the Regenerative Ag Job Board, where employers can post their opportunities and job seekers can find their next step. Please help to get this resource up and running by visiting jobsearch.quiviracoalition.org, and Quivira is spelled Quivira, jobsearch.quiviracoalition.org. Quivira Coalition, American Grass-Fed Association, and Holistic Management International are excited to announce this year's Regenerate Conference. Save the date, November 6th through 8th in Denver, Colorado. This year's conference, Innovating for a Resilient Future, will interrogate and explore data, technology, information collection and sharing, ways of learning and knowing, and the myriad approaches to fulfilling our ecological roles. Go to regenerateconference.com to sign up for the mailing list to be notified when registration opens. And now to our program. I'm very happy to welcome Mike Bollinger. He is Executive Director of Seed Savers Exchange in Decorah, Iowa. Welcome to Down to Earth.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Mary Charlotte.
So the Seed Savers Exchange is really, above all, about biodiversity, about stewarding diverse and endangered seeds and fostering biodiversity in gardens and in agriculture. It's almost 50 years old. Tell us how this started in 1975.
Yeah, so 1975, Seed Savers Exchange went by a different name called the True Seed Exchange, but the story started long before that. With one of the co-founders, Diana Otwhaley, who was raised just about a half an hour south of Decorah on a small dairy farm. When she was a child, she has a memoir called Gathering that she wrote several years ago. And in that book, she talks about kind of growing up as a child in rural northeast Iowa and remembers being in the gardens of her parents and her grandparents, and talks about, sitting on the porch and cars driving by and these beautiful kind of vining flowers growing up to the deck, and just kind of goes through the joys of growing up in rural America and the food that she was able to eat, the time in the kitchen with her grandmother, time in the gardens with her father, and breaks that they would have under a shady tree for lunch. And all of those kind of rural agricultural things that we think about. And as she got older and started to live in different parts of the United States and had met Kent and would occasionally come back to Northeast Iowa to visit family, in 1974, her grandfather passed away. And shortly before that, there were two varieties of seeds that she had been given from her grandfather. It was the Grandpa Ott's Morning Glory and a German pink tomato, both of which had been brought by her family in the 1880s from Bavaria, region in Germany, and had been with her family and planted in those gardens for a very long time. And as her grandfather passed away and Kent and Diane found themselves, with seeds that had a long history within their family, they started to think about, were there other people that also found themselves in this situation, and really started to think about the fragility of food crops like this, and and the cultural ties and that heritage. And so they started reaching out through Mother Earth News, other publications like Landward Ho, right, to just start asking, are there other people that find themselves with heirloom seeds that are interested in connecting and sharing their stories as well as their seeds? And so that was kind of the beginning of what eventually became Seed Savers Exchange.
So the German pink tomato was brought over here, and as I understand it, is still being cultivated. The seeds have been saved. What's that tomato like?
Oh, it's one of the most delicious beefsteak tomatoes that I've ever eaten. Definitely when I'm thinking about kind of a nice meaty tomato to slice thick and put on on a summer salad or on a summer sandwich, it's definitely one of our go-tos even in our own personal garden.
So the Seed Savers Exchange has a farm. It's 890 acres. Tell us about that farm and how it's used and also what it's like.
Yeah, it's a really wonderful place to be able to come to every day. It is used for a multitude of purposes. Early on, when it was kind of the home for, Kent and Diane and their family, it was also an opportunity early on as the Seed Savers Exchange started to grow, and it became apparent that there needed to be, kind of a backup or a way to be able to regenerate seeds in a place. Heritage Farm was that place. And so early on, Kent and Diane talk about, the preservation gardens that they started to grow with varieties that came into their care in order to be able to, revitalize and regenerate that seed. Eventually, it became kind of in the early days as kind of what their vision of education was. It was a place where people could come to, experience the diversity of backyard, home garden, heirloom varieties that they had the opportunity to care for that had come from all different parts of the United States. And so now, almost 50 years later, the organization has grown considerably. We kind of look at the seed work and the plant work that we do in a couple of different ways, technically referred to as in situ and ex situ preservation. So on-site, in place, and then outside of that place. And so the on-site work that we're doing at Seed Savers Exchange as relates to those food crops that are in our current seed bank, which is over 20,000 varieties, is being regenerated. A portion of that is being regenerated every year. So for example, this year we're looking at about 780 varieties that are currently in our seed bank that we're going to be growing out. And there are kind of three main reasons that we're growing things out. One is to regenerate those seeds for storage as well as for greater distribution, also for evaluation. So as we grow something out, we're looking to observe and record kind of physical characteristics and traits, as well as then as things come in, we still currently get donations that come into us every year to do a lot check, really to be able to verify that there aren't any problems, that the seed that we're growing out and maintaining is true to kind of the narrative or the history that we received from the donor. And so we have a large staff that's helping us do that work. And then the kind of educational component and the exchange is kind of that offsite and community stewardship that really is at the core of the organization and kind of where it started. So it's a community of backyard home gardeners, farmers, advocates, organizations, institutions that are also growing out and exchanging seed. So that is happening offsite in a lot of different places. And so we're kind of looking at it in those ways. On a grander scale, if we think about numbers, in any given year, somewhere between 10 and 20 acres worth of seed production area. We maintain about 700 unique varieties of apple trees here on site. So we have 2 orchards. We have a visitor center that welcomes people, somewhere between 12 and 14,000 people a year come here to be able to kind of explore the property and take in the gardens as well as the larger natural habitats that are a part of the grounds. And then we have a heritage breed of cattle that we also, Kent and Diane brought on, early on as another kind of example of genetic preservation, but also as a way to be able to use, the benefits of the manure that they produce as fertility for the farm. So we're, as you can tell, we only use a small portion of the land for actual agricultural work. Otherwise, we're doing oak savanna restoration. We have almost 9 miles of hiking trails. We've got about 4 miles of streams where people can come out and fish or just, enjoy the kind of natural environment of Northeast Iowa along the driftless region.
It's interesting because, there's this mindset that if you save seeds, like what saving seeds is saving them in cold storage. But the way you're doing it, that's kind of the least of it. It's all about, as you said, expanding and extending seeds into communities. And that's how you save them.
Exactly right. I mean, they are, these seeds, their histories, their lineage, their stories of stewardship, as well as their genetic value, are safest in people's gardens, right? I mean, that is living germplasm, literally, and all of that has a lifespan. So the importance is to keep that safe, to keep it growing, and for people to enjoy the food as sustenance.
You offer seeds through a seed catalog. There's over 600 varieties of flowers and vegetables and herbs, and that helps to maintain the organization and to spread the seeds out into the world. Tell us how it works, and how do you choose which seeds you're going to offer for sale?
Right. The Seed Savers Exchange catalog that people are aware of, and that is the kind of business side of the organization that generates revenue or a portion of the revenue for the larger organization, is really just a very small snapshot of the varieties that are in our care. The Seed Savers Exchange is really where the organization began, and is that larger community of seed swapping and exchange that is happening with a significantly greater number of varieties on an annual basis. And so the exchange, which you can find on our website and is also exchange.seedsavers.org, is a kind of open sharing platform. So we now have an online version of the exchange and a print version, which dates back to the beginnings of the organization that we refer to as the yearbook. And that is a listing of home gardeners listing seeds that are in their care throughout the United States. And they're listing the varieties that they have, that they're willing to share, that they have distributable quantities of. And so within the exchange, there are over 18,000 unique backyard heirloom varieties that are available to people at no cost. I think the way that that's structured is that the only request would be that whoever is requesting that would pay for the shipping. And so that's really kind of the core focus, is really being able to help exchange these seeds and provide the resources to be able to do that. And so the catalog, which has about 600 varieties, that development has been in a multitude of ways, but most recently, as we're looking at ways to continue to offer unique varieties in that catalog, we have an initiative that we call here, which is, we refer to it as the collection to catalog process. And so as we're doing evaluations on site of seeds that we're growing out, we're looking at traits and characteristics and things that don't otherwise look like maybe they're available kind of through other entities. This last year, for example, we were trialing a bunch of different types of turnips. And so, looking at the characteristics of those turnips, it's something that doesn't have a significant amount of stewardship happening in that catalog space, so to speak. And so we were trialing those varieties, looking at, doing taste tests, looking at disease resistance and productivity and plant health and some of these things. And we're using some of those on-site evaluations to be able to help determine what we could take smaller quantities of seed and, over the course of 2, 3, 4 years, increase to a level where, we could offer it in the catalog. In addition to that, one of the other ways that we're kind of collecting data and understanding the heirloom varieties that we have is through a community science-based program that we called ADAPT. And that is a collection of, again, home gardeners from all over the U.S. And we send seeds out, and we have kind of a platform that we're using to be able to engage and have conversations with and kind of chat, but also, get feedback on germination quality and plant health. What are the first harvests? What are the last harvests? How does it handle frost? How does it taste? And some of those things. And then we're kind of collecting that information and using that in a few different ways, one of which is to help kind of identify varieties that we could steward into that catalog environment, but also helps in kind of the grander scale of just stewardship in general, as we think about the reasons that somebody would want to care for these in their own gardens and go through the effort not of only growing the seeds for the food, but then saving that seed and continuing to care for it, hopefully getting it to a place where they're interested and then sharing that seed too, whether that be through the exchange or another platform. So we're always looking at ways to be able to increase the likelihood of stewardship in that way. One of the other things that has kind of come out of the last decade or so, as we're thinking about climate change and the way in which there's a real high intensity and focus on regional adaptability of seeds. The more information that we can have, that we can collect from gardeners, all across the country of the things that we're trialing in a given year, we get a lot of folks that are requesting seed from our own seed bank that are trialing varieties with the hopes or intention of being able to more specifically adapt these crops to regions. And so as we can think about, this tomato variety, that was grown in Georgia, or these 5 that were grown in Georgia, right here seems to be the feedback that we're getting from backyard home gardeners, and we can use that in addition to the narratives that we have as a basis for maybe breeders or small seed companies that are looking at creating the sort of heirlooms of tomorrow. They can use that information to be able to help jumpstart the process of trialing that they're doing.
So kind of another example of how biodiversity is so important in climate change adaptation.
Right. Yeah, exactly right.
If people buy your seeds or get seeds on the exchange and then start their own seed company, for example, is that considered a success? I mean, it seems like what you're doing is kind of the opposite of, intellectual property, like I own these genetics or something like that. You're just wanting to get it out there.
Absolutely right. Yeah, I mean, those are all successes. I mean, the work is so much bigger than what Seed Savers Exchange can do, and the needs are so much more urgent. We have a small part in this, and as a seed bank and a repository for, varieties that have come into our care from so many places, the work that we're really focused on is collecting the stewardship histories, trying to collect those narratives. I mean, we have seed historians on site that their full-time work is to be able to connect with donors, to understand, the care, where they've come from, why they've been cared for, how they have been used. We collect photos, right, and try to share those stories, but as well to be able to really continue to distribute and increasingly distribute the seeds that have come into the seed bank, because again, the safest place for them is in people's gardens. And if that means that the way that they get to people's gardens is through another seed company requesting seed and increasing those and helping to adapt those to specific regions, whether that be, the Pacific Northwest or the Southeast or here in the upper Midwest, I mean, those are all examples of success that we see as helping with our mission.
So the kind of seed companies you're talking about are really community-based and biodiversity-based seed companies. How does that compare to kind of the corporate seed industry? What's going on there?
So within the corporate seed industry, the work is much different, right? I mean, those are generally breeding programs that take, millions of dollars and years, right, to try to essentially expedite the breeding process of things related to specific disease resistance or productivity, or those larger seed companies that are focused on hybrids or specifically working with open pollinated varieties that are adapted to their needs and to their clientele is different in the fact that generally what we're seeing is interest for large markets, right? If it takes 5 years or $5 million to be able to create a hybrid variety that with a specific set of traits or a specific disease resistance, that needs to also then bring in a return, right? That is much larger. And so I think that you can't really look at those and think that those crops are being specifically adapted to regions or micro regions throughout the country. They're being bred and they're looking at this as a for-profit business. They're providing for the needs of their clientele, which is often farmers, but it's different work serving different communities in different ways. It's a commercial process looking at farm scale and providing for grocery stores and things like that, whereas we're really looking at backyard gardens, growing food for yourself, your family, your community, maintaining this significantly larger genetic base, and the kind of creative ways that we can all as a larger community share in this work to make sure that that is available for future generations. I mean, all of the breeding that is being done, no matter where you're at, is reliant on this kind of wider genetic base. And as we see climate change and environmental degradation, as we see, the development of urban areas, as we're seeing deforestation in places to be able to raise cattle or, other animals in South America, right? The kind of natural habitats in which this genetic base continues to evolve becomes increasingly limited, which means it becomes increasingly more important to hold on to and steward the diversity that we have. And as we see this happening in different regions throughout the United States or globally, right, where we're seeing crops going into different places and being grown, year after year, the greater that diversity is as well in those places, and as well or better suited to those specific environments in a way that, again, on a commercial scale, isn't really the focus, and we won't ever come into fruition.
No pun intended. So, yeah, I mean, I think that it's just so important to talk about the loss of biodiversity when you're talking about that kind of corporate scale, whether it's corporate seed companies or corporate agriculture. The genetic loss that happens when you do that, with all good intentions and disease resistance and all that kind of stuff, the genetic loss is so dangerous. And people like you and the many other seed-saving organizations around the country are kind of like very quietly keeping the food system safe in a way that I don't think very many people are aware of.
Yeah, we're keeping it tasting better too.
Oh yeah, tell us about that, the taste tests. I'm so glad that, I could be like getting seeds from a place that does taste tests.
Right? I mean, just the other day, right? So I'm fortunate that in the lower level of the building that I am is, a team of 13 of our preservation staff. And we got a little chat that came up and was apologizing for the intense bean smell that was kind of throughout the building. And as I went down to kind of have a conversation, we were like, what's going on right now? We were boiling 11 different kinds of beans that we had grown and doing taste tests. And, same thing that I mentioned with 5 different varieties of turnips that we were growing out in an evaluation garden this last year, because so much of it, really depends on taste, right? I mean, you want to be able to experience and talk about what's the use, how does the skin melt away in your mouth? Is it mealy? Does it have a creamy flavor? Does it feel like it's better suited for a cold bean salad or part of a bean stew? Right? I mean, there are so many different ways. And so this is just one of the ways in which, throughout the work that we do, we also have a little bit of fun, right? By doing these taste tests and getting to enjoy the fruits of our labor, no pun intended. It's wild to think about, and I don't know why this sticks in my mind so much, just the turnips that we were tasting this last year. And so, we roast them, no salt and pepper, and, kind of do these blind taste tests and have our little survey sheets that try to kind of rank the different kinds of experiences that we have in our mouth with flavors and saltiness and sweetness and things like that. But there was such an incredible difference. And I've been farming in a small scale, I've been cooperating a small scale organic vegetable farm with my wife for the last 15 years. I'm new to the role of executive director at Seed Savers Exchange. I've been here about 1.5 years. And so what I'm finding is that I've got a lot of work to do yet on being able to verbalize the way in which I'm experiencing the food that I'm eating. So I'm learning a lot in that regard too.
And then parents will be able to say to their children, eat your turnips. They're good.
That's right. That's exactly right. And so, I mean, that's another kind of interesting thing is we've kind of been talking about another publication that kind of goes back to the founding days of Seed Savers Exchange, or founding years. It was originally called the Garden Seed Inventory, and now it's called the Seed Trade Census and the Nursery Trade Census. And it's a publication that comes out in hard print every 5 years. And what we're doing there is we're really looking at Let me back up a little bit. So what Ken and Diane were looking at early on, and kind of what the constituents of the early seed bank was, split in two ways. It was backyard heirloom varieties, and then it was also kind of about 35% commercial varieties that were kind of on the verge of not being available anymore. So these were, open pollinated commercial varieties that, as kind of hybrid work was being done, where we were seeing kind of disappear from the commercial market. And so early on, Kent and Diane would use the seed trade census, and now we have the nursery trade census as well for fruits and nuts and berries, to be able to say, like, what does stewardship look like? What is the availability of these commercial varieties? Where are we, kind of looking at these larger trends, right? Currently, there's a lot of interest in tomatoes. There's a lot of interest in lettuce. That diversity is actually on the upswing. But things like beets or turnips, again, are things that where we're not seeing as much stewardship happening. So we're using that as a way to be able to kind of look at larger stewardship needs and kind of areas that need greater attention and focus. And so it's a publication that we put out to be able to say, okay, here are, currently, and we just had the seed trade census come out, there are currently, let's say, 400 seed companies. Here are all of the open pollinated varieties that are currently available across all those seed companies, as far as we can do our research. And then by having done that every 5 years, you can start to see varieties that are only carried by a couple of companies that used to be carried by a dozen, and where that kind of shift and change is happening. And we can kind of use that as a basis for thinking about the larger preservation work and advocacy work that, that we ought to be doing as we're looking to the future.
Why is it important to have open pollinated varieties?
Well, because you can save the seed and they can come true to type, year after year. It's the basis for which all breeding is done.
I mean, what's the opposite of open pollinated varieties?
The opposite of open pollinated varieties, would really be, even if you think about hybrids or you think about, genetically modified crops, these are varieties that you could save the seed from, but they will not be the next year what they were the year that you grew them out. They start to, if you think about hybrid varieties, they begin to revert back to their parent crosses. And so the beauty of these open pollinated varieties are that you can save the seed, you can plant them again the following year, and you will have the same harvest that you did the year before, which in those other examples, you don't get that.
Part of what's so interesting about your seeds is the stories behind them. And you told us a little bit about the German pink tomato. There's so many stories. I'd love it if you could tell us a few. Like, one of them is the Franny bean. That is a very storied bean.
Right. The Franny bean is a very storied bean. Part of the joy of, getting to do the work that I do is going down and having conversations with the seed historians that are actually capturing these stories. The Franny bean is one that came to, Seed Savers Exchange in 2020. It came to us from Wisconsin, and it has a storied history that stretches back to, to World War II. It talks about, in 1943, before the Nazis took, this woman and her family from their hometown in Italy, right? They took seeds, they sewed them into their clothing, and ended up in Auschwitz. It kind of tells the tale of, this woman's life experience, how eventually she saw herself through that camp's liberation in 1945, how she eventually ended up in the south side of Chicago running a drapery business, and then the storied history of those seeds continuing to be with her, growing them in her garden.
She kept the seeds. She was taken to a concentration camp.
Right.
Her talents as a gardener were recognized.
Right.
And when liberation came, she kept the seeds.
She kept the seeds. Yep. Yeah, and she was gardening, in those concentration camps, and had the ability to be able to keep those with her. There was that important. It was part of her family's history, of her life experience, of her sustenance and being able to survive all of the, the realities of those life experiences. And then she, when she ended up in Chicago and shared that story through friendships and relationships, and I think she passed away at the age of 92, in 2019. It was a friend of hers that then donated the seed to Seed Savers Exchange.
And so people can actually plant the Franny bean.
People can actually plant the Franny bean. Another example, is a story of a fish pepper.
Yeah.
That its origins aren't exactly known, right? But came from somewhere in the Caribbean. It has has been described as kind of fruity and spicy, right? It's a kind of mutant of a serrano pepper, and has kind of variegated or striped leaves, and it has peppers that kind of start as this white and yellow, and with a little bit of green, and then kind of transition to red, and have a really nice kind of spice and flavor to them. And again, as far as we can kind of trace back, or as research has shown, is that it kind of came from the Caribbean in the 1800s. They were brought to the Baltimore, Maryland area, I think by Haitians, and eventually were, getting planted out in gardens. Over time, you start to hear stories about African Americans planting, these peppers in the Chesapeake Bay area, right? That it was being, commonly used in seafood dishes. They talk about how the genetic variant there that, about, 1 out of every 50 peppers or so kind of lacks the chlorophyll, and it keeps that pepper color pale. And so it's really great as a kind of spice and flavor of cream-based sauces.
Just for the color.
Yep. And so at the same time, the value of that was also, kind of orally described, right, as a remedy for joint pain. And they were also described as being used to discourage bugs from destroying tobacco plants. And kind of as that story continues, and as people started to urbanize, these gardens kind of weren't talked about as much. You didn't, the history and kind of story of those got to a point where, the pepper was almost extinct. But then the story picks back up with a fellow by the name of Horace Pippin, who is a painter, and tells the story of losing the use of his right arm during World War I, and started to suffer from arthritis. And so he was, as the story goes anyways, seeking out bees, because at the time, bee stings were used as a way to be able to remedy that kind of pain relief from arthritis. And so Horace Pippin was exchanging these fish pepper seeds with a neighbor who was a beekeeper. The fellow's name was Ralph Weaver. And in 1995, Ralph Weaver's son, William Moyes Weaver, found a baby jar full of these seeds in his grandfather's freezer, and eventually donated those to Seed Savers Exchange as well. And now those are available, again, widely through the work of a diverse community of people that have found value in those again. And so this is just part of it, right? I mean, it really takes you through a deeper understanding of the value of food and kind of the movement of food through time. And it really opens up and kind of ties us back to this larger reality of who we are, I think, as humans on this planet.
I love that there's a profession called seed historian. And if only they could interview the seeds, there'd be orders of magnitude more of these stories that could tell us about how people use them also, as you're talking about, for different health conditions and stuff like that.
Yeah. When you can kind of have a story that's complete like that, it really brings that to life. And especially then if you're like growing that in your garden and you're eating this and you kind of have this greater understanding of, of where, the history of this food crop is great. It's also really challenging work, right? Because as you think about a lot of times, and in the early work of Seed Savers Exchange, the only information we had is what came in with a donation. And sometimes it would be a handful of words that described how it tasted, and not a lot about, the history of where that came from, or how it ended up in the person's hands that donated it to us. And so it's really a responsibility, I think, that we take seriously and that we're always thinking about is how do we do justice of the stories that we share? Because, so often, always really, the histories of these seeds go much deeper and stretch back much farther than the folks that, that are actually donating these to us. And so it's challenging and complex work, but something that we see as part of the responsibility of the organization.
You started a couple of years ago as executive director. What are your plans and hopes for the organization?
So to continue to build on the work that we're doing, I think the things that I feel like are really important here are to increase the amount of distributable varieties that we have in the seed bank. So, our farm and our farm team is really focused on, working to increase the number of seeds that we have of things that we have. So again, we may get a half a dozen bean seeds that come into our care, right? In order for that to be distributable, that needs to be, hundreds, if not thousands of seeds. We need to collect that the information that, that we can as we're going through that process. And so it's keeping these seeds alive, the seeds that are in our care, keeping those alive, growing those out every year, regenerating that for the seed bank, and then also doing the year's worth of work that it takes to be able to keep these at a level where they can be requested and shared with other gardeners. That's a really important piece. We're also then trying to expand on through kind of some of the data collection work that I was talking about with our ADAPT program and with Renew Growers, which is another program that we have that's working with folks that are actually doing some of that seed increase work for us, but trying to collect that information, because I think that, these much deeper and comprehensive narratives that include the histories and the stories that we're sharing, as well as the work that has been done on site here at Seed Savers Exchange, as well as information that we can gather from gardeners throughout the country. That kind of more comprehensive understanding of a seed increases the likelihood that they will be stewarded or cared or bred or regrown in the future. And so I think that we take that work really seriously about how we can make our best effort to continue to share the information that we have that allows it to be used in a multitude of ways. It's important to really be able to continue to resource and build community. We have, a lot of events and workshops. We do a virtual conference that starts here in May. We're looking at ways to be able to engage, not only gardeners and advocates alike, but folks that are new to gardening as well. And what are the resources that we provide to help build an awareness of the importance of this work, to be able to help them to be successful in their own early gardens. And hopefully over time, a few of them will be interested and passionate enough to be able to become seed stewards themselves over time. And so, there's a lot of work that happens in that, but really looking at trying to identify the ways in which we can kind of be most impactful in our education work is important. And then also making sure that we keep, the larger heritage farm, the 890 acres, open. That was in Kent and Diane's mind early on, that was the education, was the opportunity to be able to come here and, walk in the gardens and pull an apple from one of the trees and understand the history and experience that and be in a place that really cares for, the stewardship, not only of, the seeds and the plants and the animals that we care for, but the larger natural habitat. And it's a safe place where people can come and realize that there is hope, right? We're practicing that. We're trying to kind of do the best versions of that we know how, and continuing to try to keep that open to the public so that they can experience that as well.
Mike Bollinger is Executive Director of Seed Savers Exchange in Decorah, Iowa. You can find them at seedsavers.org. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Mary Charlotte.
You've been listening to Down to Earth. We would love it if you would support this program, which you can do by going to patreon.com/down-to-earth planet to plate, where you can sign up for as little as $3. Patreon is Patreon. And also, please rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. The Quivira Coalition is a not-for-profit and a community network of ranchers, farmers, conservationists, scientists, educators, and many others dedicated to regenerative practices that produce healthy food, support meaningful livelihoods, sustain biodiversity, and remedy the impacts of climate change. To learn more about Quivira and how you can support their work, visit quiviracoalition.org, Quivira. And finally, this show is a production with the Radio Cafe. You can check out radiocafe.org to hear back episodes of this show and also find all kinds of other shows on a wide variety of topics as well. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.